Did you know that employers can be held responsible for the actions of employees thanks to a legal principle known as vicarious liability? Imagine this, you're walking down the street and a delivery driver knocks you over because he was rushing to complete his route. Who do you sue? The driver or the company that he works for? Here's the thing, if you can only sue the driver, then the amount of compensation you can get is quite limited because that's what the driver can afford to pay. But if you can sue his employer, the company, who has much deeper pockets, then the amount of compensation you can get is a lot more. Tort law says that you can sue both. And that's thanks to a principle called vicarious liability, which is a key principle in tort law. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this channel, we like to talk about everything related to the law in very simple terms. My name is Mahela and today we're going to talk about this concept where an employer can be held responsible for the actions of an employee. Let's get started. Tort law deals with civil wrongs where one person causes harm to another person. Now the main purpose of tort law isn't to necessarily punish the wrongdoer like criminal law, but to give compensation to the victim. Normally, the person who has to pay is the person who commits the wrong. Now, if you are new to tort law, you can check out my explainer video on the fundamentals of tort law. I'll leave a link to it up here and down in the description below. Tort law also recognizes that sometimes the liability should extend beyond the person who commits the wrongs. Usually, this deals with people who are employees who commit a wrong while doing their jobs. Imagine the waiter accidentally drops an extremely hot cup of coffee on you, causing you severe burns. Who should be responsible? Only the waiter, who may not have a lot of money to pay damages, or the restaurant owners who employ the waiter? Vicarious liability means one person or organization is legally responsible for the wrongful acts of someone else. This usually arises when an employer is held responsible for the negligence of an employee. For instance, if a bus driver causes an accident while on duty, the victim can sue both the driver and the company. This principle ensures that the victim is compensated by someone who can actually afford to pay, like an employer who usually has insurance and resources. So how do the courts decide whether there is vicarious liability? They use a three-step test. First of all, there must be an employment relationship or something similar. In order for someone else to be responsible for the actions of another, there must be an employer-employee relationship between the two. In Ready Mix Concretes Limited versus Minister of Pensions, the court clarified the difference between employees who create liability for their employer and an independent contractor who usually doesn't. So what this means is that if someone is truly an employee and not simply a contractor, then the employer could be on the hook for their actions. There are several ways that an employment relationship can be established. First of all, there could be an employment contract, or you could satisfy a test like the control test, the entrepreneur test, or the organization test. For example, a nurse would be considered an employee of the hospital since she is an integral part of the business of the hospital. Thus, she satisfies the organization test. Or a security guard hired by a company to provide security for that company would be an employee of that company since the company controls the person's function. Therefore, he satisfies the control test. Now, as of recently, this question has been causing the courts some headaches. Think about Uber drivers. Courts still debate whether they are employees or independent contractors because if they are employees, Uber could be liable for accidents that they cause, whereas if they are independent contractors, Uber would not be liable. Secondly, there must be a wrongful act committed by the employee. For example, in the famous case of Lister versus Hesley Hall, the school was held liable for the warden abusing the children. The primary tort was committed by the employee, who is the warden, but the school, the employer, was held liable. In simple terms, if the wrongful act is closely linked to the employee's job, then the employer may be held responsible. For instance, if a nurse administers a wrong drug, although the primary tort was committed by the nurse, the liability may extend to the hospital under vicarious liability. Thirdly, the private tort must happen when the employee is doing his job and not off on a personal detour. In Century Insurance vs Northern Ireland Road Transport Board, a driver of a petrol bowser caused an explosion by lighting a cigarette while unloading fuel. The employer was liable since it happened during the course of employment. But if the driver went on a personal detour from his normal route and met with an accident while on this detour, then the company will not be held liable for his actions. But anytime the negligent act is linked to the employment, the employer will be liable. Recently, in Mohammed vs Morrison Supermarkets, an employee of a supermarket assaulted a customer. Even though it was violent and personal, the courts ruled that it was connected enough to his employment for the supermarket to be held liable. Over time, the courts have widened the scope of vicarious liability. In Various Claimants vs Catholic Child Welfare Society, the courts held that the religious institution was liable for the actions of the priests, even though the priests are technically not employees. But there are limits. In Barclays Bank vs Various Claimants, a doctor was hired as an independent contractor to carry out pre-employment health checks. The doctor sexually assaulted some of these potential employees, but the courts held that the bank was not liable for the doctor's actions. So why does vicarious liability matter? For victims, it allows them to get real compensation from a body that has more money to pay. For employers, it encourages them to implement safer practices and better supervision of their employees. For the society, it spreads risk fairly. Since employers benefit from the work being done by their employees, it's only fair that they take the risk as well. To wrap up, vicarious liability ensures that the employers remain responsible for the actions of their employees when they cause harm in the course of employment. The law has developed to balance fairness with accountability. If you found this video useful, check out my explainer on what is tort law next. And make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care. Bye.